The three dismissive museum guards had turned the entrance into a scene of casual cruelty. Visitors shifted uncomfortably as they witnessed the confrontation, and the young docent kept glancing nervously at her supervisor. Everyone felt sorry for the old man with the walking cane. Everyone except for the dignified elderly gentleman himself. His quiet determination was something they couldn't understand. They saw a confused old visitor who had wandered into the wrong section, an easy target for their authority. They had no idea they were about to face the arrival of the very brotherhood, whose legacy filled these halls. For more powerful videos about our military and veteran heroes, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue to tell these important stories. Master Sergeant William Eagle Patterson, 97 years old, stood with the aid of his carved wooden cane at the entrance of the National Airborne Museum in Fayetteville, North Carolina, reading the dedication plaque with eyes that had seen history firsthand. His weathered hands, marked with age spots and old scars, gripped the cane with the same steadiness that had once held a paratrooper's static line over the dark waters of the English Channel. He wore a simple brown cardigan over a white shirt and pressed khakis, his appearance that of any elderly visitor except for the way he carried himself with unmistakable military bearing. The small leather satchel hanging from his shoulder contained documents that told the story of one of America's most extraordinary military careers. Inside were papers that represented the pinnacle of airborne achievement, original orders for Operation Overlord, jump records from Normandy, and decorations that most paratroopers could only dream of earning. But more importantly, it contained photographs and letters that connected him to the very exhibits housed in this museum. William's path to D-Day had begun in a small farming town in Iowa, where he'd enlisted in the Army at 19, 3 days after Pearl Harbor. He'd volunteered for the new paratrooper program not for glory or adventure, but because it paid an extra $50 a month, money his family desperately needed during the Depression. What he discovered was a calling that would define the rest of his life. He'd earned his wings at Fort Benning in 1942, graduating at the top of his jump class despite being one of the smallest men in the unit. His instructors had called him Eagle because of his ability to spot landing zones from impossible distances and his uncanny skill at navigating by terrain features alone. The nickname had stuck throughout his career, eventually becoming more familiar to his comrades than his given name. By 1944, William was a squad leader in the 82nd Airborne Division's 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, one of the units selected for the most crucial airborne operation in military history. D-Day wasn't just another mission for the 82nd. It was the operation that would determine the fate of the free world, and William would be jumping into the heart of it. On the night of June 5, 1944, William had been one of 13,100 American paratroopers who loaded into C-47 transport aircraft for the flight across the English Channel. His mission was to secure key bridges and road junctions behind Utah Beach, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the landing zones where American troops would be coming ashore at dawn. The jump into Normandy had been chaos from the beginning. Heavy cloud cover and anti-aircraft fire had scattered the paratroopers across miles of French countryside. William's stick had been dropped 6 miles from their intended landing zone, in the middle of German-occupied territory with no idea where they were or how to reach their objectives. But William had done what paratroopers do. He'd adapted, improvised, and overcome. Using his navigation skills and natural leadership, he'd gathered scattered paratroopers from multiple units, forming an ad hoc force of 47 men from different regiments. For 3 days, this improvised unit had fought a guerrilla campaign behind enemy lines, disrupting German communications, sabotaging supply lines, and preventing an entire German battalion from reaching the beaches. The action that had defined William's legacy happened on June 8th, when his makeshift unit encountered a German convoy carrying wounded American prisoners toward a concentration camp. Against overwhelming odds, William had led an assault that freed 32 American prisoners, including a critically wounded pilot whose aircraft had been shot down during the initial bombardment. The German commander, impressed by William's tactical skill and the courage of his men, had approached under a white flag after the battle. In broken English, he'd told William, "You fight like eagles. Your country should be proud." It was the highest compliment William had ever received from an enemy, and it reinforced a nickname that would follow him through the rest of the war. William had continued jumping behind enemy lines throughout the European campaign, Operation Market Garden in Holland, the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine. By war's end, he'd made 17 combat jumps and had been awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars, and 3 Purple Hearts. But more importantly to William, all 47 of the men who had served under him in Normandy had survived the war. After Germany's surrender, William had remained in the Army, helping to establish airborne training programs and serving as an instructor at Fort Benning. He jumped with the 11th Airborne in Korea, led training missions in Vietnam, and had finally retired in 1972 with 30 years of service. Even in retirement, he'd continued to support airborne units as a civilian instructor and consultant. Today, at 97, William was one of fewer than a dozen D-Day veterans still alive. He'd outlived most of his comrades, attended more funerals than he could count, and had become a living repository of airborne history. The museum he was visiting contained exhibits about operations he'd participated in, equipment he'd used, and photographs of men he'd served alongside. He'd driven 4 hours from his assisted living facility in Virginia to attend a special ceremony honoring D-Day veterans. The museum had invited him as a guest of honor, though he suspected few people would recognize him or understand the significance of his presence. At his age, he'd become accustomed to being seen as just another elderly visitor, rather than a piece of living history. At 1,000 hours, the museum's morning shift brought a new team of security guards and docents to the main entrance. Kevin Morrison, 32 years old and recently hired as head of security, approached his duties with the officious manner of someone who enjoyed wielding whatever authority his position provided. He'd never served in the military himself but had strong opinions about what veterans should look like. Beside him stood Jennifer Walsh, 28 years old and working as a senior docent while pursuing her master's degree in museum studies. Walsh considered herself knowledgeable about military history, though her understanding came entirely from books and documentaries rather than personal experience. The third member of the team was Tommy Chen, 24 years old and working part-time as a security guard while attending college. Chen was respectful and eager to learn, but had been conditioned to follow the lead of his more experienced colleagues. As William approached the museum's main entrance, Kevin Morrison immediately noticed his age and civilian clothes. In Morrison's experience, elderly visitors to military museums were usually family members looking for relative service records or tourists who wanted to walk through exhibits without really understanding their significance. "Sir, I think you might be looking for the general admission entrance." William looked up from the invitation letter in his hand, his blue eyes meeting Morrison's gaze with the quiet steadiness that comes from having faced much more serious challenges than museum bureaucracy. "I am an invited guest," he said simply. "I'm here for the D-Day commemoration ceremony." Morrison glanced at William's civilian clothes, his walking cane, and his lack of visible military identification. His skepticism was immediate and obvious. "Sir, this is a very exclusive event. We've had problems with people claiming to be veterans when they're not. Do you have documentation proving your military service?" Other visitors in the entrance area began to take notice. Active duty soldiers and verified veterans waiting for their own processing watched as the confrontation began to develop. Some looked sympathetic to the elderly man, while others seemed annoyed at the delay. "I have my invitation and my military records," William replied, maintaining perfect composure while reaching into his leather satchel. "I'm Master Sergeant William Patterson, and I was specifically invited by the museum director." Jennifer Walsh stepped forward, her academic knowledge of military history making her confident in her ability to spot inconsistencies. "Master Sergeant Patterson, sir, I'm very familiar with D-Day veterans, and I don't recall that name from any of the documented jumps. Are you sure you're not thinking of a different operation?" The comment revealed the difference between book knowledge and lived experience. Walsh had studied D-Day extensively, but had never grasped that thousands of paratroopers had participated in the operation, many of whose individual stories had never been officially documented. "I jumped with the 82nd Airborne on June 6, 1944, William explained patiently. "I was with the 505th PIR, and we landed about 6 miles southeast of St. Mary Glees." Tommy Chen, who had been listening to the exchange with growing discomfort, looked up the invitation list on his tablet. "Mr. Morrison, sir, I do see a William Patterson on the VIP guest list. It says he's supposed to receive special recognition during the ceremony." Morrison's ego had become invested in maintaining his authority in front of his subordinates and the growing audience. "Son, just because someone's name is on a list doesn't mean they're legitimate. There are a lot of people who claim to be war heroes when they never saw combat. This gentleman is probably confused about which war he served in, if he served at all." The suggestion that he might be lying about his service was William's breaking point. He'd spent 79 years quietly honoring the memory of his fallen comrades, avoiding publicity, and refusing most opportunities to discuss his wartime experiences. He'd watched as fewer and fewer D-Day veterans remained alive, taking their stories with them to the grave. But sometimes dignity requires standing up to ignorance, not because you want recognition, but because the truth deserves to be defended. William opened his leather satchel and began removing documents systematically. his original Army enlistment papers from 1941, his paratrooper qualification certificates, his combat jump records. But as he organized the papers with the same methodical precision he'd once used to prepare his equipment before jumps, something else fell out, a small wooden box that hit the marble floor with a distinctive sound. Tommy Chen, who was closest to the elderly man, bent down to retrieve the box. As he picked it up, the lid came open slightly, revealing a glimpse of purple ribbon and gold metal that made him catch his breath. "Mr. Morrison," he said quietly, "you need to see this." Morrison took the box from Chen's hands, and his face went pale as he opened it fully. Inside, mounted on purple velvet, was a Distinguished Service Cross, the Army's second highest decoration for valor. The citation accompanying it was signed by General Matthew Ridgway, commander of the 18 Airborne Corps, and dated June 15, 1944. "Where did you get this?" Morrison demanded, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "I earned it," William replied simply. Walsh, who had been watching the exchange, let out a skeptical laugh. "Sir, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but the Distinguished Service Cross is an extremely rare decoration. They don't just hand those out to anyone. If you really earned that, there would be extensive documentation." But Morrison was beginning to have serious doubts. The Distinguished Service Cross was clearly authentic. The weight, the craftsmanship, the official markings couldn't be faked. And the elderly man's bearing, his calm under pressure, his obvious familiarity with military terminology, it all suggested someone with genuine combat experience. "Sir," Morrison said, his tone now showing uncertainty, "if you really are who you claim to be, you should have additional documentation that proves it." William nodded and reached deeper into his satchel. He pulled out a leather portfolio that contained his complete service record, his jump qualifications, his combat deployment records, his promotion orders, and his retirement papers. But what caught Morrison's attention was a photograph tucked into the front of the portfolio. The photograph showed a young William in full combat gear, standing with his paratrooper unit in front of a C-47 transport aircraft. The men were clearly preparing for a combat jump, and their equipment and uniforms were unmistakably from World War II. But what made Morrison's hands shake was the date stamp on the back of the photograph. June 5, 1944, RAF Cottesmore. Morrison had heard about D-Day, of course. Every American had heard about the Normandy invasion. It was one of the most famous military operations in history, the turning point that had led to the liberation of Europe. But he'd never considered that he might actually meet someone who had been there, who had jumped into the darkness over Nazi-occupied France as part of the greatest airborne assault in military history. "Chen," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper, "get the museum director on the phone now." What happened next would be remembered at the National Airborne Museum for generations. Tommy Chen's call to the museum director triggered a cascade of communications that reached the highest levels of airborne command within minutes. Dr. Sarah Walsh, the museum director, no relation to the Dawson, had been reviewing the ceremony schedule when her phone rang. "Dr. Walsh, this is Tommy Chen at the main entrance. We have a situation that requires your immediate attention." "What kind of situation?" Walsh asked, expecting to hear about a security issue or a problem with the guest list. "Ma'am, we have an elderly gentleman here claiming to be Master Sergeant William Patterson. He's trying to access the ceremony, but our security team thought he was lying about being a D-Day veteran." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete that Chen wondered if the connection had been lost. Dr. Walsh knew exactly who William Patterson was. She'd personally researched his service record when extending the invitation, and she'd been hoping to interview him for the museum's oral history project. "Chen," Walsh said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury, "are you telling me that museum security is detaining Master Sergeant William Patterson, holder of the Distinguished Service Cross and one of the last surviving D-Day veterans?" "Yes, ma'am." Mr. Morrison said he might be confused about which war he served in. Walsh's response was immediate and explosive. "You listen to me very carefully. You do not move, you do not speak, and you do not even breathe wrong in Master Sergeant Patterson's direction. I am personally coming to that entrance, and if I find that any member of my staff has shown 1 ounce of disrespect to one of America's greatest heroes, there will be consequences." The call triggered an unprecedented response throughout the museum and the surrounding military community. Within minutes, the 82nd Airborne Division's command staff at nearby Fort Bragg was aware of the situation. Word spread quickly through the airborne community that one of their legendary veterans was being disrespected. Back at the entrance, the atmosphere had become increasingly tense. Morrison was studying William's service record with growing awareness of his catastrophic error. Walsh, the docent, however, remained skeptical. "I still find this hard to believe," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. D-Day veterans are national treasures. They don't just walk around unrecognized. This man would be famous, would have been interviewed, would be in history books. The comment was so profoundly ignorant that several visitors in the entrance area gasped. But William's response surprised everyone. Instead of anger or indignation, he smiled, a small, knowing smile that held more wisdom than any lecture. "Miss Walsh," he said quietly, "most of us who were there never talked about it much. We came home, got jobs, raised families, and tried to live normal lives. The war was something we did, not something we were." Before Walsh could respond, the sound of approaching vehicles drew everyone's attention. A convoy of military vehicles was racing toward the museum, not with the measured pace of a routine visit, but with the urgency of an emergency response. The lead vehicle was a black sedan carrying Dr. Walsh and two other senior museum officials. Behind it came a transport carrying a dozen paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division in dress uniforms. Behind that came another sedan carrying the division commander and his staff. The convoy screeched to a halt at the museum entrance, and Dr. Walsh emerged from the lead vehicle with the kind of focused intensity that suggested careers were about to end. But she didn't approach Morrison or his team. She walked directly to William, came to attention despite being a civilian, and offered the most respectful greeting she could manage. "Master Sergeant Patterson," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the entrance area, "it is an honor and a privilege to welcome you to the National Airborne Museum, sir. I am Dr. Sarah Walsh, the museum director, and I apologize profusely for the treatment you have received." The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Every military person in the area snapped to attention. The paratroopers emerging from the transport formed a line and rendered honors in unison. Even the civilian visitors stood straighter, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. William straightened as much as his age allowed, his military bearing evident despite his advanced years. "Thank you, Dr. Walsh. No harm done." "Sir, there is considerable harm done," Walsh replied firmly, "and we're going to correct that immediately." Chapter 5. The Education. Major General Robert Hayes, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, approached the scene with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command but visibly moved by what he'd been told. General Hayes was a career paratrooper with 28 years of experience, and he understood exactly what William Patterson represented to the airborne community. He surveyed the scene, the detained hero, the embarrassed staff, the growing crowd of onlookers. Then he turned to address not just the museum personnel but everyone within hearing range. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Hayes began, his voice carrying the absolute authority of command, "you are in the presence of one of the United States Army's most decorated heroes. Master Sergeant William Patterson, callsign Eagle, is a living legend in the airborne community." He gestured toward William, his voice growing stronger with emotion. Master Sergeant Patterson was part of the greatest airborne assault in military history, the D-Day invasion of Normandy. On June 6, 1944, he jumped into Nazi-occupied France as part of the force that opened the Second Front in Europe. Morrison had gone pale, finally understanding the magnitude of his error. Walsh looked like she might physically collapse. Only Chen seemed to be absorbing the information with genuine respect rather than terror. But Master Sergeant Patterson's heroism didn't end with the jump, General Hayes continued. When his stick was scattered by anti-aircraft fire, he gathered 47 paratroopers from different units and led them in a 3-day campaign behind enemy lines. They disrupted German communications, sabotaged supply lines, and prevented an entire enemy battalion from reaching the beaches where American soldiers were fighting for their lives. William closed his eyes, the memories still vivid despite the passage of nearly 8 decades. He could still hear the drone of C-47 engines, could still feel the shock of his parachute opening, could still remember the responsibility that came with leading men in combat. On June 8, Master Sergeant Patterson led an assault that freed 32 American prisoners from a German convoy. Against overwhelming odds, using nothing but small arms and tactical brilliance, he achieved what military historians still call one of the most successful small unit actions of World War II. A woman in the entrance area began to cry. Several active-duty soldiers in the crowd came to attention without being ordered. Even the civilian visitors seemed to understand they were hearing about something extraordinary. The German commander who surrendered to Master Sergeant Patterson's force told him, "You fight like eagles." It was the highest compliment an enemy could give, and it reinforced a nickname that this warrior had earned through courage, skill, and leadership under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. General Hayes's voice grew harder as he continued. Master Sergeant Patterson continued jumping behind enemy lines throughout the war. Holland, Belgium, Germany itself. He made 17 combat jumps, earned the Distinguished Service Cross, 2 Silver Stars and 3 Purple Hearts. But more importantly, all 47 of the men who served under him in Normandy survived the war. He turned to face Morrison and his team directly. And today, at the entrance to a museum dedicated to preserving the legacy of American paratroopers, 3 staff members questioned his credentials, accused him of fraud, and suggested he was confused about his own service. They looked at his age and saw weakness. They should have seen strength forged in the crucible of the world's greatest conflict. The public rebuke was devastating and complete. Morrison stood frozen, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Walsh looked like she wanted to disappear. Chen, to his credit, had tears streaming down his face, not from fear but from genuine shame and a growing understanding of what he'd witnessed. But William raised a trembling hand, stopping the general's criticism. "General Hayes, if I may," he said, his voice gentle but carrying unmistakable authority despite his age. "These young people couldn't have known my story. Most of us who were there never talked about it much. We just wanted to come home and live normal lives." He looked directly at Morrison, his blue eyes holding no anger, only sadness. "Son, the fact that you couldn't imagine a 97-year-old man being a war hero says more about how we've forgotten our history than it does about your character. But I hope this teaches you something important. Never assume you know someone's story based on what you can see on the surface." General Hayes nodded at William's words but wasn't finished with the museum staff. "This incident will result in comprehensive training for all museum personnel on recognizing and honoring veterans of all eras. Because what happened here today cannot and will not happen again." But the most meaningful moment came when the paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne stepped forward. They were young soldiers, most born decades after William's war had ended. But they understood the debt they owed to the men who had established the traditions they now carried forward. Command Sergeant Major David Chen, Tommy's older brother as it turned out, spoke for the group. "Master Sergeant Patterson, sir, we wanted you to know that what happened here today doesn't represent the values of the airborne community. You and your generation established the standard of excellence we try to live up to every day." One by one, the paratroopers approached William to shake his hand and pay their respects. They didn't make speeches or grand gestures. Soldiers rarely do, but their presence, their obvious respect, and their quiet words of appreciation spoke louder than any ceremony. As William was finally escorted into the museum, with Dr. Walsh personally ensuring he received the VIP treatment he deserved, he reflected on what had just occurred. The incident had been painful, but it had also been educational. Perhaps it was important for young people to understand that history isn't just something that happened in textbooks, it's something that was lived by real people who are still among us. The ceremony itself was deeply moving, with William receiving a standing ovation from an audience that now understood they were in the presence of living history. But as he toured the exhibits afterward, he was approached by Tommy Chen, the young security guard who had tried to help during the morning's incident. "Sir," Chen said, his voice nervous but determined, "I wanted to apologize for what happened earlier, but I also wanted to tell you something. My great-grandfather fought in the Pacific during World War II, and he never talked about it either. After today, I understand why, and I understand why it's important to remember." William smiled, placing a weathered hand on the young man's shoulder. "Son, the most important thing about history isn't the big battles or the famous generals. It's remembering that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they have to. Don't forget that." As William prepared to leave the museum, Dr. Walsh approached him with a request. "Master Sergeant Patterson, I know you've avoided publicity most of your life, but would you consider participating in our oral history project? Your story needs to be preserved." William was quiet for a long moment, looking around at the exhibits that told the story of American airborne forces. "Dr. Walsh, I'm 97 years old. Most of the men I served with are gone. If my story can help people understand what they sacrificed, then yes, I'll tell it." 3 weeks later, William received a letter from a young high school student in North Carolina who had seen news coverage of the museum incident. The student wrote, "Dear Master Sergeant Patterson, I'm writing a report about D-Day for my history class. After learning about what you did, I understand that history isn't just dates and battles, it's about real heroes like you. Thank you for your service." William kept that letter on his desk, next to his Distinguished Service Cross and a photograph of his unit from 1944. It reminded him that heroism isn't just about the dramatic moments when the world hangs in the balance. Sometimes it's about the quiet dignity with which we carry our memories, the grace we show when others fail to understand our worth, and the responsibility we have to ensure that the stories of sacrifice are never forgotten. Before you go, I want to hear from you. Have you ever met a veteran from World War II or other conflicts? Have you ever taken the time to listen to their stories? Share your experience in the comments below. These living links to history won't be with us much longer. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you that heroes walk among us and that we should never take our freedom for granted, hit that subscribe button. Because every veteran has a story worth telling, and every act of service deserves to be remembered. Remember, freedom isn't free, and it's preserved by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. We owe them our gratitude, our respect, and our memory.